Fixing prescription drug pricing has consistently been a top issue for Americans year after year, including the vast majority of both Democrats and Republicans who want to see a change because they simply cannot afford their medications.
Democrats in the U.S. Congress finally succeed in saving a watered-down proposal to allow the federal government to negotiate and lower the cost of prescription drugs in the United States. Hello and welcome to Inside America with me, Rida Fakhri. It is one of the key provisions in President Biden's Build Back Better legislation, which is expected to be voted on this week in the House of Representatives, and something Democrats have been working on for several decades: how to regulate and lower the price of prescription medication in the United States. According to a new report, prescription drugs in the U.S. are, on average, 256% higher overall than 32 other countries. U.S. prices are 170% higher than they are in Mexico and 779% higher than they are in Turkey. For brand-name drugs, the gap is even higher, 344%. Now, earlier this month, congressional Democrats managed to revise and save a reform proposal on prescription drugs that was originally dropped from the Build Back Better Act, Biden's wide-ranging social spending bill. Under the new plan, the U.S. government would negotiate the cost of 10 drugs starting in 2025, and pharmaceutical companies would be penalized for price hikes exceeding the inflation rates. The original plan to allow the government to negotiate the price of first 25 and then 50 prescription drugs would have saved, according to the White House, $450 billion over 10 years. Under the agreed plan, those savings will amount to $250 billion. Raja Krishna Murthy is a Democratic congressman who represents the state of Illinois. He is a member of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform. Congressman Krishna Murthy, just why has it taken this long for Democrats in Congress to finally agree on legislation that would give the federal government a basic, limited amount of leverage to negotiate the price of pharmaceutical drug prices?
Well, thank you for the question. It's taken a long time because the pharmaceutical industry is very powerful in Washington, D.C., and so they've managed to avoid a lot of these reforms for a long time. But now, finally, we've arrived at an arrangement, at least tentatively, and I'm looking forward to voting for it in the days to come.
You call it an arrangement, Congressman, but just how much of a victory, how much progress does it really represent when you consider just how much Americans still have to pay for their medication compared to people in any other country in the world? Today, 18 million Americans still cannot afford their prescriptions. 88% of Americans say they want Congress to do something about it.
We need to do more, but what's contained in this bill is language that for the first time would enable Medicare to finally negotiate the price of prescription drugs. It would cap the amount that people pay for insulin to no more than $35 a year. It would cap the amount of out-of-pocket costs that seniors pay, which now is in the several thousand to $10,000 a year range for many seniors. And so we're looking at some significant steps forward, but I think we need to keep working on it, and hopefully in the years to come, we will make further progress on this issue, because you're correct, Americans pay way more than what even Europeans pay and others pay, sometimes as much as 3 times what they pay.
But how much real progress, though, can you really hope to make, let's face it, when you consider that 2/3 of members of Congress cashed a campaign check from the pharma industry ahead of the last election in 2020? 72 senators and 302 members of the House of Representatives, according to the latest data.
Well, I think that at the end of the day, we have to do what our constituents want. And what our constituents want is real drug price negotiation by Medicare. They want lower prescription drug costs. I've been at so many town hall meetings where seniors bring their prescription drug price bills to the town hall meeting to illustrate exactly what they're talking about. and it's time that we actually do something about it significantly.
But again, the question is, can you? Because pharmaceutical companies and their lobbying groups gave $1.6 million to lawmakers in the first 6 months of this year alone. Republicans received $785,000 and Democrats got $776,000. Many have said, quite bluntly, that Congress is being bribed by Big Pharma. Can you ever lower the price of prescription drugs if members of Congress keep receiving these huge sums of campaign funding from the pharmaceutical industry?
Congress has no choice because this is such a huge issue that if we don't get our arms around it, it's going to bankrupt our seniors. It's going to bankrupt our Medicare system. And so this is something that we have to do. And it doesn't really matter at this point what the pharmaceutical industry says. This is just an imperative.
Haven't Democrats in Congress been a big part of this problem as well, this collusion? Because Democrats received 61% of the pharmaceutical industry's campaign contributions in 2020. They tell voters that they will take on Big Pharma, as you say, and that they will force them to lower their prices, but they continue to be bankrolled by the very same industry they promised to take on.
Well, I can tell you that that might have been the case in the past, but right now, this particular bill contains provisions that Big Pharma does not want. And so I think that there's just a recognition on the part of a lot of people that this just has to get done. And if we don't do it, then we basically are not doing what our constituents want.
How do you explain, though, that just last September, because you mentioned that this is what used to happen in the past, but just last September, 3 House Democrats killed a provision to lower drug prices by voting no, alongside all the Republicans sitting on a House committee that was looking into the issue. And Social Security Works, an advocacy group, said at the time something along the lines that it was disgusting when politicians who supported Medicare negotiations in the past switched their votes in exchange for Pharma cash. Do you agree? And what needs to happen?
Well, I think that those same people are now, I think, at the table with regard to negotiating this particular language that the pharmaceutical companies don't want. So I'm hopeful that we're making progress. I think a lot more needs to be done, quite frankly. I don't think, for instance, that we should just be negotiating the price of 10 drugs in 2025. We should be negotiating many more drugs, and we should also be moving up the date, at which this legislation becomes effective. But for right now, if we can do this, we're going to take the next step after that as well.
Congressman Raja Krishna Murthy, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Now, a new report from the House Oversight and Reform Committee, which Congressman Krishna Murthy is a member of, recently published a report that looked at the spending of 14 of the biggest pharmaceutical companies here in the U.S. Among its findings were that the 14 companies spent $56 billion more on stock buybacks and dividends than they did on research and development between 2016 and 2020. The report also found that the same companies spent a combined $31 million on lobbying in the first quarter of 2021. The pharmaceutical industry has far outspent any other industry in the U.S. on federal lobbying, with over $263 million spent so far this year, almost more than twice the amount spent by the next industry. Lobbying spending has increased every year since 2013, reaching a peak in 2020 of $309 million. Pharmaceutical industry lobbyists, who outnumber members of Congress 3-1, have targeted a key provision in the Democrats' social spending bill that would lower the price of prescription drugs, claiming it would hinder research. They have run at least 20 advertisement campaigns on television and online across the U.S. According to Open Secrets, the ads were paid for by Pharma, the industry's main lobbying group, which spent $23 million in the first 9 months of this year alone and is expected to break its previous record, close to $30 million spent in 2019. For more now on how Big Pharma shapes healthcare policy in the U.S., I'm joined by Saul Anousis, president of the 60 Plus Association, a conservative lobbying group in Washington, D.C. Saul Anousis, why do groups like yours, the 60 Plus Association, continue to pour so much money into attacking legislation that would benefit Americans, especially seniors, that would allow the US government to negotiate on their behalf to lower the price of prescription drugs?
Well, there's a couple things that come into play here. First of all, we believe we ought to try to lower prescription drugs at every chance we get. But from our perspective, we want the market to make that decision, not arbitrarily made by the government. What's happening right now under the current plan, they're looking at moving some $500 million out of Medicare and moving it into some of their other programs, including the Green New Deal and other things. And so there's some political motivations with regards to why they're doing what they're doing. So our concern is we should let the market work, use competition to determine those prices, fight for lower prices, work for lower prices, but make sure that we have innovation, that we have research, and that our seniors have access to the different drugs that they need.
But they don't, and that is the reality. Take insulin, for example. More than 34 million Americans have diabetes in this country. That's over 1 in 10. Is it acceptable to you that a fourth of Americans aren't taking insulin as prescribed because of the skyrocketing costs?
No, not at all. I mean, I think they ought to be accessible and available to everybody.
But then how do you explain that they
question-
aren't? How do you explain that the average cost of the same vial of insulin is over $98 here in the US, just $12 in Canada? Insulin prices are 8 times higher in the US than in many, many other countries.
Well, first of all, you have to remember that with regards to prices in the US, it's kind of a tricky situation because we fund all the research and development for all the drugs that are done. So what happens is the drug companies, the pharmaceutical companies are doing research and development for drugs that are then sold internationally for much less than they're sold here, because for all practical purposes, unfortunately, Americans are forced to subsidize the research and development that has made all these great drugs available worldwide for everyone.
But we're not talking about the price of insulin in India. We're talking about the price of insulin in countries like Canada or Australia.
Sure.
How do you explain that in those countries it's about 90% cheaper? Why should Americans pay the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs?
I don't think they should. I think that we should have equitable pricing across the world. But the reality is what happens is that we have no control over the pricing in Canada and Australia, where those countries can basically discount the prices and take advantage of the subsidization that America is actually having.
But you have control over the price in this country. And the truth is,
That's right.
you have been spending hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to try to kill any legislation that would lower these prescription drugs. If you accept if you accept that costs are too high in this country, do you accept it, yes or
Sure.
no?
Absolutely.
Shouldn't something be done about it? The US government is saying it wants to negotiate to bring the price down.
absolutely.
You're not letting it. The pharma industry won't let it. The lobbyists won't.
Well, first of all, you're making the assumption that this bill actually will accomplish what it's saying it's going to accomplish. What they want to do is move $500 billion out of Medicare and move it into other programs. And then they're using the excuse that we will, quote unquote, negotiate prices to bring these prices down, and therefore it won't affect Medicare. The reality is that most of the Democrats would like to move to a single payer system, which basically means you socialize medicine for the United States. We have some 60 million seniors that currently depend on Medicare in the United States of America. And many of them have ability to get it through private services, through different competition, et cetera. If you were to socialize the medicine and socialize the cost and determine what they are, all of a sudden the government would determine what kind of drugs you could use, when you could use them, limit the treatment that people are available to get.
But you've been calling it, hold on. You've been calling it socialized medicine since the 1990s. Is it socialized medicine? Is it socialist? Is it even radical to make sure that Americans who need prescription drugs can actually afford them?
Well, I think there's a lot of ways to create options for Americans to afford those drugs.
How is it socialized?
And socializing it, is it not?
How is it
Well,
socialized?
it's socialized if government sets the prices, if government sets the terms, if government determines the treatment that is available. I mean, look, if you take a look at countries that are doing this, like the United Kingdom and others, who've actually had to institute death panels when they couldn't give enough, when they couldn't provide the services that are out there. I don't want government determining who should get what kind of treatment under what circumstances. We have a system that allows the market to work. There's a tremendous amount of options that are available. We should continue to push for more competitive services, for different types of insurance to be available. As an example,
So hold on, no. So you want to continue the maximum profits. at the expense of people's health care. That's what you're suggesting.
I'm not suggesting that. I mean, that's what you're assuming
You
is
say
the
you want
end
the
result.
market to determine the prices. The
That's
market
right.
is driven by profits.
Well, the market is determined by profits, which allow us to do research and provide new drugs. If drug companies were nonprofit, then the government could just basically produce their own and take it over and quote unquote socialize the system. I don't think that serves the senior citizens in America or the rest of the world very well.
Hold on.
So
So you
we're trying to
mentioned you mentioned that the profits would allow you to do research and to innovate. This is an argument that we have heard ad nauseum and that has been refuted time and again. The pharma industry is not the only industry that has to innovate. Car manufacturers have to innovate, plane makers have to innovate,
Right.
everyone has to innovate,
Sure.
but the margins are not as exorbitant and inconsistent depending on where they sell their products. And they still make profits.
Well, that may be.
But let me just tell you as well about what the overwhelming majority of Americans want. And you know that as well as I do. If you look at the recent polls, 88% of Americans favor allowing the government to negotiate for lower prescription drug prices. That's almost 90% of people in this country. Is there anyone who would want to pay more? Would you want to pay more?
No, I don't think anybody would want to pay more, but I think it's a very easy argument to demagogue and politicize that takes for granted the fact that this has a real effect on the treatments available for seniors, on the drugs that will be available for seniors, on the innovation that actually will take place for future healthcare services that are offered. So it's very easy to say, oh, we ought to take away all the profits and come up with a way to basically offer free drugs, low price drugs, without understanding and putting them in the context of what these drug companies are actually doing.
Well, no one is suggesting taking away all the profits. The pharma and healthcare industry is also heavily subsidized by the government. But many in Congress believe it's all down to greed. Senator Bernie Sanders tweeted this a couple of days ago. He said, while we pay the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs, 1 out of 4 Americans cannot afford the medicine they need. The top 15 pharmaceutical executives pulled in more than $470 million in salaries and bonuses last year. Greed, greed, greed. Is there any other way to explain it?
Sure. I mean, Bernie Sanders would like to have a single payer system that ultimately socializes medicine in the United States of America. In their program, where they're shifting $500 billion out of Medicare, they're also trying to push a whole bunch of unfunded mandates to provide other types of services. This system, this Medicare system, is about to go bankrupt. We are basically, basically moving money out and playing political shell games in order for the Democrats and the liberals who want to push for a single-payer socialized system. I think that's bad for seniors. I think it's bad for Americans, and I think it's bad for the general public with regards to having the kinds of products, the kinds of services that are necessary to keep people healthy, extend their lifestyle, and deal with the quality of life issues that are important to most seniors.
And there's plenty of money to be moved around without making the taxpayer and patients who need the drugs pay for it. Why not use the millions of dollars that are spent on lobbying, on research and development and innovation? According to Open Secrets, your group spent over $21 million on lobbying between 1998 and 2017. There are more than 1,500 lobbyists on Capitol Hill. That's money that could be well spent somewhere else, wouldn't it?
Well, potentially, but the whole point of lobbying and the whole point of engaging in public discussions about this is decide which policies make most sense. I would argue that moving to a single-payer socialistic system that Bernie Sanders and many of his allies want is bad public policy. It's bad for seniors and it's bad for America.
Saul Anus is president of the 60 Plus Association. Thanks very much.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Now, as part of the latest proposal in the Build Back Better Act, seniors who are enrolled in Medicare's prescription drug benefit plan would pay a maximum of $2,000 out of pocket per year. According to Patients for Affordable Drugs Now, an independent national organization, out-of-pocket costs for some specialty drugs can run as high as $15,000 a year or more, while the median income for Medicare beneficiaries is around $26,000 per year. David Mitchell, a cancer patient with multiple myeloma, is founder and president of the organization. He joins me now. David Mitchell, as a cancer patient, you depend on drugs for your survival. You expect to be in continuous treatment throughout your life. How has this never-ending debate on Capitol Hill affected you and your ability to get the treatment and the medication that you need?
Well, my cancer is incurable, and I require very expensive drugs to stay alive. Uh, the list price of the drugs I take, my doctors have me on a 4-drug regimen, is more than $900,000 a year. Just one of those drugs, an oral drug under the Medicare prescription drug benefit, costs me more than $15,000 out of pocket. I'm very unfortunate. I'm very fortunate. These drugs are literally keeping me alive, but I've learned a tough lesson through this journey, and that is drugs don't work if people can't afford them. And so we are fighting to try and make drugs more affordable so we can get both the innovation we need as patients, but at prices we can afford.
And how do you manage to do this, given the reality on Capitol Hill for the past decades? I know that you have 40 years of experience working on healthcare and public health policy. What do you say to lobbyists who argue that lowering the price of prescription drugs would hinder innovation and the development of new drugs and the influence that they're able to exercise on members of Congress to keep it that way?
Well, Pharma has been peddling the myth that we can't have lower prices and innovation in new drug development for years. It's just not true. Pharma runs profits that are almost 3 times the average of the S&P 500. Pharma spends tremendous amounts of money on advertising and marketing and stock buybacks. The fact is that we could take $1 trillion out of this industry over a 10-year period in revenue. They could maintain their R&D, and they would still be the most profitable industry in the world. There is plenty of room to lower prices and maintain innovation and R&D, and that's especially true because so much of the foundational research that leads to innovative new drugs is coming from the federal government, from taxpayers, through the National Institutes of Health.
As you point out, it's $1 trillion industry in the United States. How do you hold Big Pharma accountable, given the huge financial influence it has over members of Congress, who eventually have to pass new legislation?
Well, we're very fortunate, frankly, that 90% of the American public is demanding that something be done. They want the government of the United States to be able to negotiate on their behalf for lower drug prices, which is done in every other country in the world. And it is that political demand that puts us in a position to maybe overcome the lobby force and power of the drug companies. Remember, there's 3 lobbyists up on Capitol Hill for every member of Congress, and they are spending hundreds of millions of dollars to prevent any meaningful reform. We think this year we may begin to get some meaningful reform in spite of that, but it will be because of the demands of the American people.
David Mitchell, wishing you good health and all the best
Thank
in
you.
your continuing medical treatment. Thank you very much.
Thank you for letting me talk today. Bye.
Any visitor to the United States who watches mainstream TV channels at any time of day or night will be struck by one phenomenon. Every other ad, if not more, is for prescription drugs, as if the entire American population was ill. In fact, the visitor might even be shocked because unless you come from New Zealand, no other country in the world allows TV commercials for prescribed medical drugs. In 2020, the pharma industry spent $4.5 billion on TV ads. That's around 75% of total ad spending, according to some studies. If you could just go to the supermarket to buy prescription drugs, you might be able to explain why the industry would spend so much on TV commercials. But you can't, nor do you want to. So why invest so much on these ads? The US has the highest healthcare per capita spending in the world, and by far. In 2019, it was $1,229. In Canada, $879, and in the Netherlands, $430. Now, with the COVID-19 pandemic, it is only likely to increase substantially. And so, in short, when you consider that in 2020, the healthcare sector amounted to 18% of the US GDP, which is the highest share of all OECD countries, the nexus between big pharma and politics becomes a little easier to explain. Big business ultimately drives the agenda, and even well-meaning political forces are unable to effect any change. The only option is to make a very dire situation just a little bit less worse. In the US, election cycle after election cycle, the question of healthcare and the price of prescription drugs is high on the agenda, and for good reason. But for lawmakers, the priority may not necessarily be the health of average Americans. It is rather the political benefits they draw from a lucrative and wealthy healthcare sector. What must scare many of them is how to rein in a powerful $4 trillion industry. That's all from Miri Dafakhri and the team in Washington. Thanks for watching.